Hello, and thanks for tuning in and joining myself, Steve Hayes, and Michael Darby for one of our regular updates on regulatory matters across the globe. Hopefully today we're going to take you through a number of different topics coming up. So we're going to have a quick look back as to what's gone on since our last video. Amazingly, it was in June, the other side of the summer, for those in the Northern Hemisphere. And then forward-looking in terms of other industry events and topics coming up. We've actually, this time of year, got really quite a busy schedule. So we have things like the TCB Council coming up, we have the Red CA, we have the IEC and CISPR meetings coming up, we have other industry events. So there's quite a lot to talk about. So hopefully we're going to whet your appetite as to what the hot topics are at the moment, and then in our next video give you a summary of those discussions and maybe some of the main points that's come from it. So I think the first of the events, Michael, is TCB Council coming up. That's at the end of October?
That's correct, Steve. Yeah, so it's the last week of October, school half term if you're living in the UK. So there'll be a Monday, which is like a basics foundation day for anybody new to the industry, where a selection of people from our industry give real groundwork kind of training. I'll be doing the first presentation of that day on the basic regulatory concepts. And then the main workshop is the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. And this is a twice a year event happening. It's actually a big celebratory event. It's the 50th TCB Council workshop. So the first day will be kind of international bodies. So there'll be a presentation from NIST to see what other sort of regulatory activities are happening around the world. There'll be a presentation from ISED Canada on the regulations there. I'll be speaking about what's been happening in Europe and in the UK, for example, with the Radio Equipment Directive. I'm sure a big focus there will be things like harmonised standards and, of course, cybersecurity. And then we'll be sort of sharing some updates from around the industry. And then the middle day, Wednesday, that's the big FCC training day where they spend the whole day teaching us all the new changes and trying to clarify other things that they may have published. And then the final day, the Thursday, this is really industry day. So people from around the industry will come together and volunteer a topic to talk about. So we've got presentations there, for example, about adaptive power density. This is like the RF exposure test. If you go above 6 gigahertz, where you stop doing a SAR test and you do a power density test. Presentations on the latest standard development for Wi-Fi 6E in Europe. And I'll be giving a presentation about multiple models from a test lab point of view. Yeah, as a test lab, we're often asked, hey, I've got these 5 models, they're similar but slightly different. Could you test one of them, maybe partially test another one, and somehow issue a report to say that all 5 of them comply? And for some regulatory domains, that's really not a good thing because actually the testing is part of the authorization. And for other regulatory regimes, such as Europe, for example, a manufacturer does have the legal flexibility to do a full test on one product and then do a sort of justification or evaluation of other models. But it's important to remember that that's the manufacturer's process, and an accredited test lab can't magically claim that something complies if they haven't tested it. So I'll be giving a presentation about that.
Interestingly, you picked up and introduced a new acronym for us there, APD.
Yeah.
So average power density. Adaptive power density, absolutely. And of course, we've already got that acronym in the industry already as amplitude probability distribution, which is a digital assessment on the interference potential from a disturbance source. So in these events, we'll have to iron out our acronyms or certainly come up with a glossary so we all understand what we're talking about.
Exactly. It's such an acronym-rich technology or industry that we work in. It's inevitable that you're going to get overlaps. I remember a few years ago, before COVID, when we had the SAR virus going around, and our SAR labs were having to say, look, this isn't what we do. Okay, so then what are the FCC going to talk about on their middle day of the Wednesday? Well, we never know until we get there. They keep their agenda pretty fluid and pretty loose. One important thing will be the changes to their RF exposure guidance. I've spoken about this before. the FCC changed their FCC rules back in May 2021. And the industry's kind of been on hold with implementing that rule until the new guidance comes along. So the FCC is to publish the guidance so that we know how to implement their rules. And this is a KDB 447498, more acronyms throwing around there. And this is still a work in progress. And a group of us in the TCB Council Board of Directors have been working on comments, and we've been submitting comments to the FCC about that. Probably some of the biggest impacts for industry is the fact that the FCC rule change states that any RF source must have an RF exposure evaluation. Previously, it listed specific FCC rule types, cellular devices, Wi-Fi devices, things like that, and everything else was exempt from a routine evaluation, meaning it didn't have to do a test. But now any RF source does need an RF exposure evaluation. Well, firstly, you think, wow, okay, so I make a low frequency, low power RFID, that suddenly brings me into the picture. And that is true. And that's a difficult topic for them to address. But one of the more controversial changes is, of course, an unintentional radiator. So, for example, the EMC emissions of a product. And so the FCC have made this statement that the EMC emissions or spurious emissions of harmonics from the radio must all be taken into consideration to contribute to the RF exposure assessment. And so we've been trying to say, right, okay, well, you're asking for this, so now we need a procedure. Now, there are some labs, I think Element, in fact, has worked with the FCC and manufacturers to develop test procedures, but until the guidance is clear, we don't know exactly what the FCC wants. Interestingly, there's nothing in the European regulations which excludes EMC emissions from RF exposure, but typically people only ever consider it for transmitters. Another big thing that the FCC have talked about since our last presentation in June was the topic of the Part 15 antenna. I mentioned before that there was a suggestion that any time an antenna was installed into something else, if the gain wasn't known, then the gain of the end product may need to be tested. And that's been clarified now, that what the FCC really need to see is for any Part 15 transmitter, there must be a very clear description of what the antenna is. Now, if you buy in an antenna, whether it's a chip antenna or a dipole or a monopole antenna, you've probably got the data sheet, and that's okay. But if you have an antenna which is maybe a PCB trace or a piece of wire or its own design, then a really accurate description of that antenna must be in the certification, because for a Part 15 transmitter, the transmitter hardware includes the antenna. The trick then comes if you've got a sort of custom-made or PCB trace or wire antenna for something like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, where the antenna gain must be known. And up until now, we've seen manufacturers say, well, I don't really know what the gain is, or we think it's maybe about 2 or 3 dBi. Whereas now, if there isn't a clear data sheet, there'll need to be an antenna gain measurement. Another important change in the draft guidance, the KDB 447498, the guidance of how to implement those new FCC rules, is the threshold that determines whether a SAR test is needed or not. So the basic concept is something that's very low power doesn't need an RF exposure test. Something that's very high power and would fail a test obviously can't be sold. And then there's that middle ground where the power is high enough, it requires a SAR or RF exposure test. And that's a really important thing. And interestingly, over the years, when I first became a TCB, the FCC had a power threshold where it said, if you're over this threshold, you have to do a SAR test. If you're under this threshold, you don't. Canada was a bit more relaxed. They had a lower threshold. And then Canada updated their requirements, so they became more strict than the FCC. And then the FCC updated theirs to become more strict. And then Canada updated theirs to become more strict. And well, you can guess, this new FCC guidance makes theirs more strict again. And so the threshold at which a product may or may not require a SAR test, for example, will be changing. And not only that, but the sort of criteria for assessing the power. The FCC have suggested that even for a portable wearable device, the antenna gain would be relevant in determining whether a SAR test is needed or not. Personally, I disagree with that on technical levels, but we can go into that on another video. But the point being that if you've got a type of product, remember for the FCC, it's a certification process. So if your product is already certified and the FCC update this guidance, they're saying that you're not going to have to recertify those old products, and it's not going to affect the certification of your existing products. So that's good news for manufacturers. But if you've got a series of very similar products and you've been used to the fact that you never have to do SAR on them because they're just under that threshold level, be careful, because when these new guidance come out, that threshold level is going to come down. Suddenly your product range that you're newly certifying, you might have to start budgeting for some SAR testing. So then as soon as the TCB Council workshop finishes, then the following week you're off to San Francisco.
I am, yes. So the IEC General Meeting this year is being hosted by the US National Committee in San Francisco. The IEC General Meetings typically take happen over a 2-week period. And these meetings cover every type of IEC standard that is available, right the way from environmental, mechanical, how a fastener should look, how it should work, what a laser is, the wavelength of a laser, and it covers things in our world as well. So things like EMC standards, both emissions and immunity. And it covers some of the other things that, Michael, you were talking about before, which is the SAR or power density measurements as well. Interestingly enough, actually, Element is doing a demonstration in the IEC meeting. So TC 106 is the committee responsible for RF exposure tests or standards. We're helping do a demonstration there so people can get more familiar with those types of measurements. For me personally, I'll be heavily involved in the CISPR meetings. For those that aren't aware, CISPR is a subset of the IEC that is focused on coming up with standards for the emission measurements from products themselves. So the sorts of things that we cover are automotive products, household, industrial, scientific and medical, information technology or multimedia is referred to now, the whole or full gamut of different product types. So there's a pretty full agenda over that 2-week period. There's lots of plenary meetings, so plenary being, if you like, the management committee for each of the standards themselves. And then we move into working group meetings. And very often when there's a plenary meeting, that attracts members from many countries around the world. I think there's something like 167 countries represented. And so they take the opportunity to join in some of the working group meetings that they would otherwise probably not participate in because of the extensive travel that would be involved for a few-day meeting. Lots of topics to discuss, lots of new standards. There's been a number of CISPR standards updated over the last couple of years, right from the fundamentals of how you should do measurements. So that's what we call the CISPR 16 series. So this is what a test receiver or a spectrum analyzer looks like, right the way through to this is what an artificial mains network or an antenna, how you calibrate a chamber. And actually, because of technology and the way that that's moving, there's a lot of work for measurements below 30 megahertz. If you think of lots of switch mode technology, so electric vehicle charging, renewable energy with PV inverters or grid connected inverters themselves, that actually creates quite a lot, or has the potential of creating a lot of disturbance below 30 megahertz. So in the last couple of years or so, we've seen a lot of new standards coming along for how do you calibrate a chamber below 30 megahertz, how do you do the testing, and one of the more contentious things, which is what are the limits below 30 megahertz, especially for when we're talking about really high power devices, maybe for charging an electric vehicle or a UPS or some of these really high power devices. And really the primary concern is making sure that we set emission limits that actually protect the radio spectrum. In terms of other standards, there are lots of initiatives within the multimedia community. What historically we would have called information technology equipment. So obviously we have technology convergence now. So, if you think about your home, for example, we have many IoT devices. We might think of that as an IT device historically, but equally it's used in a household environment. So multimedia and household, these things the requirements have got to align because it's the same electromagnetic environment. Measurements above 1 gigahertz. Typically we're testing up to 6 gigahertz now, and so many of the CISPR standards are looking for measurements above 6 gigahertz, 18 and 40, and certainly when we go above 18 gigahertz, that in itself requires new measurement detectors, new ways of doing the measurements, new test procedures. So you can imagine there's a lot to talk about over that period of time during the meetings themselves. So that will be a lot of debate over that period of time in San Francisco, and when Michael and I do our next update, hopefully we'll be able to bring you some of the main discussion points and certainly some of the conclusions from those for you when you tune in next time. So that was CISPR, and immediately after CISPR, the following week, we were going to be heading to Spain, but actually that's an online event now. Michael, did you want to talk through some of the topics maybe that are going to be talked about on the online meeting?
Yeah, so that's the REDCA, or REDCA, Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association. So it's the official group for Radio Equipment Directive notified bodies. And there'll be a closed session just for notified bodies, and then there'll be a couple of days for the whole industry, including test labs and manufacturers. And again, it's a meeting that happens twice a year, and it's an important step in our calendar. So I'm sure that, as ever, there'll be input from the European Commission, from ETSI, and from market surveillance, things like that. I suspect one of the big topics will be cybersecurity. I think I talked about this last time, about how the EU has published a regulation on cybersecurity which outlined which types of devices would be in scope of the cybersecurity requirements in the Radio Equipment Directive. So this is Article 3.3 D, E and F of the Radio Equipment Directive. Those have been enabled now, and so we know which types of product are going to be in scope. And that we know that requirement will begin in August 2024. So until then, we're in a kind of preparation phase. Now, when we last spoke to you in June, we didn't even have a clue what the requirements would be. We knew that there was going to be a requirement, and we knew which types of product would be covered, but we didn't know what those requirements would be. Well, since then, the European Commission has decided which standards group to submit the standardisation request to, and they've sent it to CEN-CENELEC. So the standardisation request has been published, so now we can see the types of requirements that will be in the standards. It doesn't mean the standards exist, and it doesn't mean that we have test cases, but now we know which types of product will be in scope and what kind of requirements those products will need to meet. So we're getting closer and closer to having a picture of what manufacturers will need to do. And in fact, this is, although we're a long way off having an actual standard, we're in a really good situation now where manufacturers are coming to us and they're speaking to me and saying, okay, I can see my products in scope and I can see the requirements that my product will need to meet. I don't have a test case yet. And then I'm sort of saying to those manufacturers, okay, how would you, as a manufacturer, demonstrate that your product meets those requirements? And again, some manufacturers are going to just wait until an actual test case exists, but other manufacturers are looking at this and saying, well, actually, we already do a lot of these things, and so they're already on a good way towards towards being able to demonstrate some sort of compliance with the Radio Equipment Directive. In parallel to that, the European Commission has also published a Cyber Resilience Act. And this is kind of an industry thing which could end up, everyone's quite keen that you won't have a dual set of requirements. You won't have to meet the Radio Equipment Directive and also some industry regulatory act. And so, it's not impossible that the Cyber Resilience Act could somehow supersede the Radio Equipment Directive, but it's also possible that one set of assessment could meet both requirements. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that. Another big topic that will be discussed is always interesting to hear the input from ETSI on their standards writing. Those of you who've been keeping your eye on standards developments will have noticed a lot of the EMC for radio product standards are being reissued. This is the EN 301489 series of standards. And they keep getting issued and reissued, and a big part of that is trying to pin down this topic of legal certainty. Now, when I first heard that term, legal certainty, it was kind of a confusing thing to me, because I thought, well, how can testing to a standard give you certainty of compliance with a directive? And that doesn't match up with the fact that the manufacturer always has to write a risk assessment. So if the standard gives you certainty to the directive, and then you've also got to write a risk assessment, that didn't really make a lot of sense. But it makes sense when you realise that the term legal certainty simply means that the law is equally applied by each company. So, for example, if 100 different manufacturers all read a standard and they all applied the standard, then they would all come up with the same solution. They would all apply the standard in the same way. A fantastic, easy analogy for that would be speed limits. We don't say drive at a speed that you think is safe. We say drive at, for example, 30 miles an hour. Now that doesn't guarantee that you won't have a crash, but it means that there's a fixed limit that everybody can see and everybody can understand. Now if we apply that kind of logic to these EMC standards, one of the big things was in the past the standards might say set up a radio link so that it's working, and then do the EMC test and check it continues to work in a way that you're happy with. So two of the big changes are, firstly, that just continues to perform in a way you're happy with has been clarified as continue to work in a way that that product is intended to do. But also this arbitrary kind of set up the radio link is being more clearly defined, whereby the manufacturer has to find a minimum operating sort of level of receiver input and then back it up maybe, 20 dBs for example, so that it's in a comfortable working environment, but that every manufacturer will be doing it the same way. So the test cases remain the same, but how the product is set up changes and how the product is monitored changes. So interestingly then, you could have many manufacturers saying, well, I don't know if my product met those new requirements with my old testing because I didn't look closely at how I was setting it up before. So it's possible that a product could fail or pass a standard now that they've previously passed. And so there will be some retesting going on. And in fact, with the radiated immunity, the exclusion bands, these are changing as well. And this is all a really good reminder that those EMC standards, the EN 301489 series of standards, are not harmonised on the Radio Equipment Directive yet. And they haven't been able to get harmonised on the Radio Equipment Directive official journal yet because of these inconsistencies and these kind of vague topics. So ETSI is working very hard to keep updating their standards, and then the manufacturers, you need to remember to keep up to date on those.
It's an interesting point actually, because when it comes to performance criteria, many of these 301489 standards have said that the performance shall not degrade below a performance level as defined by the manufacturer. And to your point exactly, when the manufacturer is defining something, one manufacturer may define something in a different way to another one, going back to your legal certainty.
Yeah.
And so this whole concept of having generic requirements and standards is starting to go away very quickly, hence all these new standards being published. And so, if it were, I don't know, let's for argument's sake say it's an Ethernet router, and it had a 1 gigabit per second performance, then that's the minimum performance that should be experienced during EMC testing, not some other number as made up by the manufacturer.
Yeah, we got into a situation where a lab would test a product, it would perform poorly, and then the manufacturer would go, actually, we're okay with that. It's a cheaper product, we're happy with that. That's unacceptable now. It's more the case that the manufacturer says, here's my product and here's what it does. The lab tests it, and if it doesn't continue to do that, then the lab can't state it complies with the standard.
It's a great point. And then, yeah, so that's the Red CA meeting. And then I guess really the last one, which is a little bit more European focus, is the EMC Test Labs Association. It's just celebrating its 30 years next year.
Yeah,
can you believe?
Correct.
That's amazing. But one of the objectives of the EMC TLA is to talk and debate some of these topics, again, to make sure that there's a certain amount of harmonization between one lab and another. So many people join EMC TLA to enable them to get an update of what's going on in the industry, but also talk to other test labs to make sure they're not doing anything that is different to the other labs.
Yeah. I think it's a general understanding that most labs know that if we all start offering completely different services and suggesting different things and interpreting standards in different ways, it's really not going to help anybody. So obviously we all compete on customer service level and types of facilities and capabilities that we offer, but we all try and collaborate to a point that we go, right, here's a standard, this is how it should be interpreted. Let's all make sure that manufacturing industry has a pretty constant set of information on that from us.
So thank you for tuning in today. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight as to the events and topics that are coming up in our industry from a regulatory point of view. Hopefully we'll get back together by the end of the year and let you know how it's gone. So we're going to be summarising output from TCB Council, from the Red CA, some of the CISPR and IEC standards, and any other topics that may come up in these events that we haven't thought about just at the moment. We'll give an update and a summary of, say later in the year. So thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time.
Thanks very much.